See if there's any other surprise guests that we get as we get going on this. But really appreciate you joining us today, especially as the whirlwind of December starts in earnest. We know it's a time of year when you're bouncing between getting your work finished for the year and all the kind of various external stuff that's going on at this time of year. So we really appreciate you making the time. I think we'll make a start now, and then if there are any other latecomers, I'm sure that they'll catch up as we go along. So welcome to the second webinar in the Wordnerds third level Insight Rail series. We really appreciate you being a part of this. Once again, it's great to see so many of you here. We are, to be fair, a mixture of intimidated and incredibly excited by the caliber of people who've signed up to come and listen and to contribute today. And we hope that you will contribute to this as much as we do. Today, we're going to focus on an area that I guess is often discussed by insight companies like ours. And it's usually discussed in the least helpful ways imaginable. And that area is performance. We've taken performance to sort of broadly mean when things go wrong in the progress of a passenger journey from the passenger's perspective. So delays, cancellations, shortened trains, drop reservations, that kind of thing. And we found in the past, organizations who've been reporting in this area have produced generally one of two types of report. You either have the blindingly obvious and impractical. So the people like their trains to be on time. Have you thought of making the trains be on time? Or the relentlessly negative, just reflecting back the anger that people do feel when their trains are delayed. And obviously people do feel anger. But I think where we came to with this report is that there are also innumerable examples of people in rail at an individual or at an organizational level who are making life better for passengers when they experience performance issues. And when you get that right, and there are examples of every single TOC in the country getting that right at times, you can reduce complaints, you can improve customer satisfaction, you can turn the most negative situations into a positive. That's what we want to focus on with this report, which will be released tomorrow. So this is a wee sneak preview of it. You will be getting this information before anybody else. Is the best practice we see and the positive practical things that you can do today to make those situations for passengers better. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by two of my favorite word nerds today. Up first, we have Kelton Lawrence, who is one of our big data experts and is the principal author of the report that we're releasing tomorrow. Kelton, I don't know if you want to say a few words of introduction. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, by all means. It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for the kind introduction there. It is true what Joe says in the chat there. He does say that to everybody, but we appreciate it regardless. Yes, so I've been with Wordnerds for, let's see, about 8 months now. So this was my first Christmas party that we had just mentioned before. So that was a fine experience. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure just sort of sinking into the data and seeing some really wonderful examples of, of TOC staff helping people out and people being really pleased with their service and, and many, many examples of, as Steve says, best practice. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you all.
Thank you, Kelton. What did you get in the Secret Santa at the Christmas party?
Of course. So I was very kindly gifted by our resident data scientist, one of our resident data scientists, a Lonely Planet guidebook to walks all around the UK. I only moved up to Newcastle probably 6 months ago now. And so I've been missing Sheffield, I've been missing the easy access to the Peak District. So that was the perfect gift for me. And I very much appreciated it.
Fantastic, and a lovely insight into Kelton there as well. Also joining us today is our head of marketing, Joe Hutchison, who has been also looking at this challenge and is here today to essentially be your voice in the room. Joe, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself and what you'll be up to today.
Hi everyone. As Steve mentions, I'll be kind of plate spinning in the background, but I have been involved in seeing a lot of you sign up, and as a massive brand geek, I am a bit of a fangirl of a lot of you, and it feels like mini celebrities. It's really sad, but we are so happy to have you all here. Yes, I'm really excited to get stuck in and kind of feed your questions into Kelton and Steve and see what we can get discussed.
Yes, when Joe says to someone, you work for LNER, it's a bit like somebody else saying, you used to be in the Sugar Babes. It's that sort of level of, wow, I can't believe I'm meeting you. So that's always great fun. Joe, what was your Secret Santa gift? And then I promise we'll start on real.
I got this off actual Kelton, which a lovely plant pot that is, I don't know if you can see, can't see, magnetic for when I run out of shelf space, and a gorgeous book called The Naturalist, which I much remember saying, not the naturalist, the other one that could be awkward. But yeah, I'm really excited to read that over Christmas, and I quite smug that I finish on Friday, so I'll be tucking into that for a long Christmas break.
So Kelton is a hill walker, an excellent gift giver, and also the author of the report that we're here to talk about today. And we do want to hear from you guys as well. We know the level of expertise and experience that we have listening to us right now. We would be hugely grateful if you share your best practice, your thoughts and opinions on some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. Any questions that you have, we can look into the data for you and see if we can find some answers. But first of all, just to give you a very brief overview of kind of how we came to the conclusions that we'll be discussing in this report. I think that, as many of you will be aware, the main problem that Wordnerds has been put on this earth to solve is the problem of language. The problem that, unlike numbers, which are very straightforward, and a 3 is always a 3, and a 5 is always bigger than a 2, and a 7 is a 7, whether you are in the northeast of England like us, or you are in the North Island of New Zealand. The words do not work like that. It is entirely possible to say the exact same thing using utterly different words, using an entirely different vocabulary. And conversely, no word always has the same meaning. An example that we sometimes use with our banking customers on that is the example of outstanding. We generally think of the word outstanding. If you saw that in your somebody describing your company as outstanding, you'd be thrilled by that. Outstanding is always a positive word unless you're talking about debt, in which case it's the worst possible kind of debt you can have. So every single word is policing. No word always means the same thing, and there are any number of ways of saying the same thing using different words. And that's before we even get into colloquialisms and misspellings and sarcasm and all those various things that make language so wonderful and so interesting and so endlessly nebulous and difficult for a computer to comprehend. So nice, easy, straightforward problem that Wordnerds is trying to solve. We do that using a range of different methods. The first is around, we use artificial intelligence in order to categorize things better. So grouping together text, not just by what that text says, not just by the words it uses, but by what it meant. And then equally with, as Kelton has been using kind of regularly in this report, we also attempt to get to that third level insight. This is why the report is known as third level insight. We think of third level as going beyond the categories, going beyond just, was this about a delay, or was this about catering, or was this about accessibility, or whatever it might be about. And going into what are the specific, actionable, and also calculable, quantifiable topics in your data that you can go and action. I think unlike most other tools, we are specifically focused on action. And hopefully you'll see that in the report as well. Kelton, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about some of the specific techniques that you used in order to extract some of the information that we're that we're talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were working with a pretty sizable data set, about 6+ months of tweets, totaling around 500,000. And thankfully for me, our platform did the work of picking through each individual one of those. I didn't actually have to manually do that myself. But yeah, without kind of delving too much into the kind of the platform itself, we use a couple of different techniques to chop up the data effectively. So we will have the kind of categories that are surfaced, generally across issues of delays and issues on board trains and issues on board stations. But then within those, we're able to train our platform's AI to effectively sort of identify fairly disparate topics within those. As Steve said before, a lot of the language that customers use around delays, for instance, are wildly different. I mean, one example I always kind of like seeing is one about the 1703 is late versus the Flying Scotsman to this destination is a no-show. Those two things obviously have nothing to do with each other in terms of keyword taxonomies, but our platform is able to pick those up and place them in the same little box because they do belong together. So I did quite a lot of that, putting together these sort of themes based around the context of language, and kind of from there started building out these different stages of the journey that we'll be exploring in the webinar today. So hopefully you'll get a little bit of an insight into the process that we use ourselves to analyze this kind of data. And of course, as Steve said before, you guys are the absolute experts here. So if you do see anything, or you think you can add anything, or you have an example of best practice throughout, please do throw it in the chat. That'll be really helpful for us to kind of surface and share with everyone, because that can only add to the value that we're all going to get out of this report.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kelton. And without further ado, let's get into some of the things that that the report kind of surfaced in terms of best practice that's being used, areas of particular concern for passengers, and how some TOCs are, I guess, kind of overcoming them. There are three main areas we're going to be looking at in the next 45 minutes. On the train, so the onboard stuff when you are on a train and either a delay is called or there's an issue with the train. Then at the station, so you are waiting at the station, and a train either doesn't turn up or is delayed. And then in the aftermath of that, and I think there's two kind of key elements of that. Firstly, what then happens once you leave that delayed train, and then what happens the next day, and going into the kind of the delay repay and those kind of administrative things that have to happen after a delay has happened. So we're going to go through those one at each time. As I said before, please do feel free to add your own questions about these areas, or particularly any kind of best practice, anything that you've found in your work with performance that you think works particularly well in helping customers when they are in a situation where their train has been delayed. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. So we're going to start with on the train. You have, you as a customer, as a passenger, are on a train, and then there is a problem with that train or a train before, or something happens on the line, and it means that that train is now going to be delayed. There's kind of some key areas that we're going to be talking about here, and in this section, we're going to be looking first at information, then at staff, and then at how what happens with other aspects of customer experience in the context of being on board a train during a delay. We're going to be starting with information and announcements, and there's kind of, I guess, a couple of key elements there. The announcements actually on the train, so the over on the kind of the passenger conversation, and then the social media, how the information can be disseminated through that way as well. Kelton, you started by looking at how I guess kind of the anatomy of an effective announcement on board a train. And you seem to come up with some really interesting elements of that part of the experience.
Yes, so full credit to the passengers who are kind of sharing their experiences here, of course, because this is all drawn from the data that we are seeing. But one thing that came up time and again in terms of best practice, and something that really sort of raised the sentiment of passengers who are on board delayed services, was around announcements from train managers or from drivers throughout that for a number of different reasons. First among those is the really positive comments seem to circle around frequent announcements. So there was one case in particular where even though they were waiting outside, I believe it was Sheffield, they were waiting to go in, but there was something wrong. The train had been sat there for a number of minutes, and a couple of passengers had tweeted about this. But the driver had been keeping them up to date about what was going on, even though there weren't any real updates to give, i.e. we're still waiting at this red signal, and I'll update you again in 5 minutes if there is anything further to know. And people really appreciated that. The transparency was a huge aspect of it for them, even though it wasn't necessarily going to get them there any faster. It wasn't necessarily resolving the delay for them. Having that extra layer of understanding for passengers really, really helped their experience and helped boost that sentiment, as I said. Now, kind of on the flip side of that, of course, we see the other side too, where there is sort of a lack of information. And that's not always, it doesn't always have to be sort of the grand, terrible delays that do occasionally happen, unfortunately. It can even happen on the really small fry stuff that actually doesn't make a huge impact on rail lines in general, but there were a few people sat on kind of trains down near Brighton who they had been waiting for 10 minutes and they hadn't heard an announcement yet. And they were getting very upset about this. And even though there wasn't any compensation involved, there wasn't any kind of grand delay to the rest of the line as a result, it was still something that sort of grated on them because they weren't getting these regular updates. There wasn't as much transparency there for them. And so that was something that I saw surface quite a bit in terms of information and announcements while on board, is that the transparency and sort of the frequency of announcements can really help with that. And of course, when a train manager jumps on and gives a funny little speech, or someone's waiting on a commuter tube on the Central line in London and their head is down and they just want to get home, but the conductor on the platform is just giving everybody a cheery greeting with every train that unloads, that really does go a long way to boosting that sentiment as well. Just those softer little things that can change the course of someone's day somehow.
I think that's fascinating. I think the first thing you said there, I thought was particularly interesting around the fact that even if there isn't any new information to announce, people appreciated the announcement to the point where they were actually tweeting about the announcements that weren't actually giving them any new information. They were just appreciative of the fact that they felt as if they were being kept up to date with what was happening. That's a fascinating kind of, and I guess the received wisdom as well is the fact that that you should be very formal in these kind of scenarios. And I think again and again in lots of these kind of situations, with customer complaints in a bunch of different areas as well, a bunch of different sectors that we work with, you do see this tendency towards people being kind of displaying humanity, being really well received, and there's a bunch of areas that we've looked at with regard to calls, and the more formal a customer service professional is, the less likely that person's to form a connection with them. So that's a really interesting area, and I think the transparency stuff as well that you speak about is really interesting. Do let us know what you think, though. Are there any kind of how formal or informal do you feel an onboard member of staff should be when they are essentially delivering bad news, right? Or even, as we've said, delivering no news. what should the tone of that be? It is a fine line to run. I'm sure you could definitely go too far in the other direction. But that kind of that kind of regular update and that transparency, I think, is really interesting. So let's talk about staff. Kelton, again, you've I think one of the really enjoyable things about looking through this data is that the amazing examples of staff in lots of different situations going above and beyond and giving kind of and in order to give good service in difficult situations. I think that you felt, it seems like that was really reflected in your report as well, Kelton.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was one of the really uplifting parts actually about looking through some of this data, was seeing examples pulled out by passengers in situations where they were able to shout out a staff member who had helped them out, or just sort of give a general, round of applause to a certain kind of train staff or a certain set of station staff. And again, to kind of sink into platform terms for a minute, just again, the sort of sentiment that we applied, the average sentiment across comments relating to staff was incredibly high by comparison to other issues. It was sitting at a 64 by comparison to most other sort of issues in a similar realm, sitting in the mid 40s usually. And that was, I think, kind of emphasized for me by the, or highlighted rather by the language we saw in a lot of these comments as well. A lot of them were actually quite heavily juxtaposed, kind of within the same Twitter tweet, I guess there's a word for that. Within the same tweet, a passenger would go from describing their horrendous delays and how they had been sort of arrived so horribly late, and in almost the same breath, going straight through to talking about the fantastic staff and the first class service they received, and things like that, that really demonstrated that even if they had been in a fairly unpleasant situation in general, the actual sort of empathy of the staff and these, especially on the train, staff members keeping an eye out for people, or as I said before, kind of making those announcements, or just generally having sort of empathy towards their passengers, went a really, really long way. And I think that was something worth noting, was that the overall sentiment surrounding delays was brought up by several points, purely based on the interactions of staff with the customers.
That's really, and I think that's a really interesting area to think about, is how can we go about celebrating those individual contributions of staff, because as you say, they seem to be the most appreciated aspect of this. And I think one of the things that I think, one of my key takeaways from Kelton's report is that the majority of people who are commenting on this stuff, even when they are commenting in a complaint, they are understanding of the fact that sometimes delays happen, and they are really appreciative of when a member of staff goes out of their way to help. And I think it should be a source of a great deal of pride within the rail community that so often the member of staff will go the extra mile and will, I mean, we saw some extraordinary examples of that in doing this report, and I'm sure you will be really interested to see the ones with your talk, because they were pretty common across the whole network. So it's really wonderful to see that kind of coming, and that the on the frontline staff are actually raising the sentiment of these kind of most difficult situations, which is really great to see. Joe, did I see a kind of a question or a comment coming in there?
Yeah, we had a comment from Michelle Grimshaw. Well, thank you, Michelle. She makes a really great point in that she says, I think that sometimes the lack of info can come from not wanting to give the wrong info, as this can cause confusion and further anger or frustration. Things can change so quickly on the railway during disruption that there is a chance wrong info or out of sequence info can be given out. And I think that from the point of view of the staff kind of in the thick of it, I think that's a totally fair point. So where you guys have discussed that showing empathy would potentially fill that gap, where you don't want the staff to have to give the information that they're not sure is accurate. But yeah, thank you, Michelle. That's a really great point.
Yeah, thank you again for kind of bringing that up. That is obviously, you know, there are situations in which that just won't be possible, and none of these are sort of blanket solutions, of course, but there are a lot of situations like that where just staff members being transparent about the fact that they can't necessarily share anything further, or they're still waiting on, kind of a little bit more information, things like that. We have seen just comments like that, like I said before, really sort of hit home and have passengers understand that the staff are doing their best, and that they are more likely to have just a little bit more patience if they're open like that. But thank you for the comment.
Absolutely, I think it's a brilliant point, and I think I can totally see with the rapidity of that change, you are going to hit those situations where if you jump the gun on releasing information, you might end up at the point where that anger will only be intensified by incorrect or misleading information. We definitely saw kind of elements of that as well. I think of people saying, "I saw this on social media, and then the train conductor told me that." And I think I think the Kelton's point, I think, is still really interesting, of the fact that even if you can't tell them anything because you don't know yet, not the act of announcing that makes people feel more like things are happening, even if it is just to say there's nothing I can tell you right now, which was, I think, really an interesting way of approaching the problem that Michelle describes really eloquently, of when you can't say anything just yet, because if you say the wrong thing, that's going to cause significant problems later on. Telling them that you don't have anything to tell them is in and of itself a reassuring act, which I think is really interesting. In terms of other areas on board, Kelton, you did some interesting some interesting insights into what happens with other aspects and comforts of the onboard experience when a delay is going on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So this was an interesting one to me, actually, because it sprung out of looking at general sort of negative sentiment around delays and seeing exactly what drove that. And in some quite specific cases, not always across the board necessarily, but generally in the more negative ones, unfortunately, it's often driven by sort of problems that compound themselves as a result of delays. So obviously things that we'll be familiar with, like overcrowding and other things like that can't necessarily be avoided in the event of cancellations. But there are some sort of other comforts that become even more important during delays that might not be so kind of carefully considered in what otherwise might have been a shorter journey, for instance. So catering services obviously being one of them. There have been fewer as a result of COVID. They are coming back in now, but that's not necessarily consistent 100% of the time. And so one of the things that sort of became apparent was that actually customers are happy to basically kind of source that for themselves if they're given the opportunity to, but the opportunity to find out whether or not catering services will be provided, or whether or not the sort of cafes on stations will be open or closed, aren't always available very far in advance. So they can't stop into whatever the station M&S on the way through and pick up a sandwich. So that was one of the things that popped up quite a lot. But on the flip side, obviously, that came with positive aspects of the sentiment as well. Complimentary bottles of water in heat waves and things like that, cups of tea and vouchers to use in station cafes went, once again, a really long way to reassuring customers that they are being seen and that their problems, well, the kind of onboard staff might not be able to resolve whatever is going on further down the line. They can provide just a little bit more comfort. For instance, if onboard Wi-Fi isn't working, for instance, that is one thing that people were encountering with not a ton of frequency, but on occasion. And things like that, catering services delivering to your seat might rely on the onboard Wi-Fi. And if that's not available and they can't make it to the catering car due to accessibility issues or overcrowding, something like this, those problems can compound. So going a little bit further to make it clear to customers in advance what the availability will be, and making sure that they can, sort of stock up on snacks in advance, might actually, again, go a little bit of a further distance towards cheering people up in situations like these and making sure that they feel comfortable, at least in the delays, until they can reach their destination and sort of sort things out for themselves from then on.
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. I think that's really interesting. The idea of when you are in a situation where there's a delay, what can you? I think it exacerbates all the other kind of standard grumbles that you might have about a service. And actually, where there are situations, obviously it's not always possible, but where there are situations that you can fix some of those smaller grumbles, that actually makes the delay itself feel better. And we've seen some great examples of talks, as you say, handing out water, handing out vouchers for teas and coffees and that kind of thing. That is often kind of one of the simpler things that can turn a really negative situation into a positive one. Conversely, when you get the situation where I think you saw a lot of examples, Kelton, of someone going, my train is delayed and X, Y, and Z is also wrong. And actually those kind of things are making the kind of the delay worse, and sort of thinking about if people are in a really difficult situation, what simple things can we do on board to make it easier? I think it's a really interesting area. I'm conscious of time. Please do add your own examples of best practice of any kind of comments you have about anything that Kelton has said there about the kind of the on the train experience. But we'll move on now to the to at the station. And obviously, once again, in this area, information is kind of key. And getting that kind of the right information quickly to passengers in the event of a delay. And Kelton, I don't know if you want to say a bit more about what happens with announcements on the station and what might be easy to improve there.
Yeah, of course. So I held off from this on the onboard announcements because I think there's a little bit more to say about it at the station, but social media plays a huge role here for many talks. So social media is very often praised for its speed of response. Kind of social media teams will often sort of see a complaint surface, and it'll be a great avenue for quickly resolving issues and having them be resolved publicly too, which does matter quite a bit when, I mean, those of us who have Twitter can be aware it can descend sometimes into a fair pit of negativity. But of course, the downside of that is if the talk doesn't respond, it can descend into a fair pit of negativity. So there are two sides of the coin to it there, but I think the vast majority, once again, of comments that I saw there were some exceptions where a problem hadn't been publicly resolved or something like that, but there were many more where customers and passengers were expressing their thanks. They were saying, okay, you've just saved me this effort dealing with this delay. I know now to get this train, or that information's been corroborated, or I wasn't able to get access to any information at the station, and you've really helped me out there by kind of doing the research online for me. So there's a lot of benefits to it, I think, and it certainly, to a certain extent, outweighs the negatives that can be seen. But kind of in situations like that where maybe social media can't help so much, and you are concerned about the disparity between the kind of information and worried that they might provide the wrong information, that's where the announcements at the station really come into their own. And obviously, once again, that can't always be nailed 100%, but ensuring that there is consistency within the station of the announcements. So whether there is a change on a board, we saw from our accessibility report recently that it's really valuable to many passengers to ensure that there is a corresponding sort of announcement over the tannoy, so that if they're not able to make out the board for whatever reason or don't have a line of sight on it, then they know that their train has just been changed to platform 4 and that they need to get over there rather than seeing a bunch of people stand up around them and move. And once again, having that consistency across a station and ensuring that those announcements are inclusive and they reach as many people as possible can once again go a long way to alleviating passenger concerns in situations where things might be changing rapidly and might be causing delays in other areas.
I think that's really interesting. And social as a kind of a way of getting information out there is really useful. Obviously, not everybody has it, and so you need to be careful about that. But we did see a lot of thanks and positivity towards your social media staff as well as to your ground staff, and that was really great to see. I think there's definitely kind of interesting things to think about with regard to accessibility as well. If you are interested in performance and you haven't checked out the Wordnerds accessibility report, I'd recommend taking a wee look at that as well. Obviously, all the issues that we're describing today are significantly worse for passengers with accessibility needs. So definitely do check that out as well. Joe, I think I've seen another couple of questions coming in.
Yes, we've actually had a really good one here, especially about sources. So someone's asked, specifically in context to Wordnerds, but do we do text analysis on other sources? So for example, customer surveys where, although it's not live on the ground, like kind of Twitter feedback, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. That's the kind of question we absolutely love. Yeah, in terms of this report, we wanted it to be a kind of an even ground between all the TOCs, whether or not they're Wordnerds customers. So we have only used social data for this report. But for our customers, we looked at all kinds of surveys, customer service, chats on that are directed at directly at the TOCs, and kind of all those sort of the other data sources. Basically, wherever someone's a customer is trying to converse with you, we're probably dealing with a TOC somewhere where we're using that data. But for this report, we're specifically looking at social, just so that it's consistent across all the different TOCs. Thank you for a great question. In terms of the staff again on platform, Kelton, we once again, I think we've seen some really great examples of staff going kind of above and beyond for customers that find themselves in a difficult situation.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said before, reading about the staff was always the most uplifting part of kind of the research that I was doing, because I was able to pull out plenty of people calling out, first of all, calling people out by name for assisting them. One person literally just talking about how they had forgotten their glasses and couldn't make out the sign, and someone at one of the members of staff at the station came over and helped them out. This is a problem I can relate to, and just little elements like that where people will then go onto Twitter and shout them out and kind of share that with everyone around them is quite a good way of kind of reassuring people that the help is there if they need it. There was one example that I just loved of there were individual station staff members who were off duty, who had kind of finished their shifts and were on the way home at Liverpool Lime Street. And there was a father who had been on a delayed service with his young child in a pram, and he had shopping in one hand and the pram in the other, and he was really kind of struggling. And these off-duty station staff members had helped him get the pram up the stairs and helped him carry things up, which was just very sweet. And again, obviously, you can't expect all your staff to go off-duty, running around, helping kind of every passenger they see in distress, but it's just examples like that that show that there is that level of empathy from staff towards passengers. And I think that connection is very important. And that's something that I saw consistently across stations and on board and on social media. In all of these situations, there are plenty of examples of staff both being shouted out for and demonstrating just kind of really wonderful human goodness, I think. And that was really lovely to see.
Absolutely. There was an example that I saw as well for one of the TOCs where I was looking through their kind of most common topics, and I saw Eddie continuing to come up, and I was like, well, this sounds. I looked into it, and this was a station. It was a driver of the train who'd waited behind after his shift to ensure that a woman who'd been stranded there was okay. And I mean, it kind of, this word is overused, but it kind of went viral. It was one of the most talked about things across the whole of the TOCs data in that month, because so many people were seeing this example and saying, well done, Eddie, and thank you for doing this, and buy Eddie a pint kind of thing. So that was those kind of examples are really wonderful to see. And I guess there is a question for the communications teams in TOCs of what can we do to show these examples and make more of the amazing work that they do, because it really is something that and obviously, as Kelton says, it can't be an expectation, it can't be something that people are expected to do, but it is amazing how often off their own backs people are doing this kind of thing, which is wonderful to see. Joe, do we have any more questions, comments, anything else we should be?
Yeah, we've had another brilliant one from Michelle. I'll just read it out. So she says, I think we need to be better at communicating those announcements somehow, using, by the way, this is Michelle's, we've got record of Michelle's idea here before I share it, before anyone pinches it, because it's so good. So she says, using systems, apps to target ticket holders via their mobile devices, instantly reaching out to those wearing headphones, which I just think is absolutely marvelous. And this was touched on in the accessibility webinar, where how can you I guess have announcements that can reach everybody at the right time. So I think Michelle's idea is spot on, and we have record of it here.
Wow, yeah, copyright Michelle Grimshaw 2021. That's what a fantastic idea. And I think, again, sorry to hark back to our previous webinar, but one of the kind of the key issues that came up there was people who are hard of hearing. When an announcement comes over the tannoy, there's no kind of clear for people who are hard of hearing. There's no clear kind of, unless you happen to be, even if you just happen to be looking at the board at that time, and often the boards didn't reflect the change. But even if they did, that kind of you have to be looking at it. You don't get that kind of auditory, hey, this is happening. So if there's a vibration on your phone, to be able to say, hey, this has changed, I think that's a wonderful idea, and also kind of an incentive to download the TOCs apps and that kind of thing as well. So that's a fascinating idea, and I hope we call it the Grimshaw maneuver from now on. It becomes like the Fosbury flop in high jump. Thank you for that, Michelle. That's really fascinating. So if we move on now, I think, and we're not moving on too far, I suppose, to the direct aftermath. So someone is either their train has been cancelled, or they have arrived in their in a station that they might not know, kind of a lot later than they were expecting. And there were some kind of some really interesting areas to look at within this section.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, in kind of scenarios in the aftermath with unmanned stations, especially, or kind of after hours, this is the kind of situation where where kind of passengers can be at their most vulnerable. So people, like Steve said, who have arrived at a station that they're not familiar with, or there aren't any staff around, and it's quite late at night, that can make things difficult for people, especially when they're not entirely clear on what TOCs obligations are to them as well. So an interesting one I saw was a lot of people not being exactly clear on what TOCs actually sort of were obligated legally to do when you arrive late or you miss a connecting train or something like that. A lot of talk about the taxi obligation was a topic that popped up. And I found that quite interesting, that obviously the wording in the kind of conditions of carriage is a little bit more nuanced than that. And it does try to allow for a lot more scenarios, but a lot of people will find it a little bit difficult to understand when they are in that much more vulnerable situation and, are stranded 40 miles from home and they have no way of getting there. So, I mean, there was one example in the data set of a woman who had tweeted a talk about her teenage daughter who had gotten stuck quite late at a station in Milton Keynes after trains were canceled. She was quite far from home, and it didn't actually receive any public response from the talk as well. And even if it were swiftly resolved behind the scenes, if the reason that conversation didn't carry on was because it wasn't actually a problem after all, that did remain there. And a number of several more people got involved, waded into the conversation, and and the tweet in the end gained a fair bit of traction. So I think just that in itself is an illustration of how important it is for these things to be handled quite carefully, and ensuring some kind of rapid response on social media, even if there is just someone on call a little bit later to keep an eye on these things, just in case someone does need emergency help at that point and they're not sure where they can go. Just having someone able to signpost them to whatever help is actually available to them and what they're actually owed could be a really valuable way and a more effective way of kind of solving that problem in some situations.
I think that's really interesting, Alan, because I think it's really interesting that obviously a lot of the time the situations where the passengers find themselves in the most vulnerable situations or in the most difficult situations are kind of by definition at the times where the kind of the main social media team isn't there, when they are, when they're tucked up in bed a lot of the time, and that does present a bit of a dilemma, I think, for TOCs, is that, I think that as Kelton's already said, there's a huge amount of support for customers who have issues between 9 and 5, or and I know that there's the timings for TOCs do vary, but within that kind of period where the majority of the social team are there, they're going to get really quick, useful feedback and advice, and they're often really grateful and thankful to that. But actually, when they really need it is when a train comes in at midnight and they don't know what to do. And this example here of a TOC who didn't respond to a teenager on their own in a station, I mean, that is something that's completely understandable because the social media team that's not part of their on-call time. One thing that we've been experimenting with at Wordnerds with West Midlands Metro through the WM5G program is to essentially build an AI that looks for tweets like that. So when somebody says I'm stranded at the station, or I'm, or there's a kind of a situation in antisocial behavior, or really anywhere where a passenger seems to be in a vulnerable situation out of hours, so out with the time that the social media team will obviously jump on that straight away if they're there. Having a kind of an AI that will be going through looking for those things and then emailing a relevant person when that kind of situation comes up. I think there's definitely things that AI can do here to kind of to complete that kind of that loop. So rather than having to have somebody checking on social at all times, having the AI do that is almost like a robot night watchman, and then emailing the relevant person, the person on call, when there seems to be a situation where a passenger is in jeopardy. Because obviously, what none of us want to see is a situation where there's a passenger, in a situation where they are, in a station late at night and feel alone. And I think that kind of, so there's definitely things that technology can do here, really quite simple things that can make a difference in that specific type of situation. But I think it's a really interesting area. So the passenger gets home, they then have to figure out what to do next. And this is a kind of again, an interesting area that I'm sure many people on the call will be only too familiar with. So please do give us your thoughts and comments on it. But delay repay, Kelton, you also looked into how passengers found the service when they were looking to get some money back for a delayed service.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this issue in particular is very interesting to me because I think it's actually where our kind of context themes surfacing those little special nuggets of information that you might not find otherwise is quite crucial, because obviously with delay repay, it will surprise no one to find that there's a lot of upset people who are tweeting about delay repay. If they get upset enough to tweet about it, chances are. But I think that the really interesting part about it was that there were a lot of people tweeting about, or rather a subset of people whose problems might be more solvable, tweeting about sort of being a little bit confused about the process or struggling to find a certain ticket number or having difficulties accessing the right people or accessing the right form. And I think that is where the most impact can be made. And again, sometimes social media teams would wade into the fray. But in other situations, those things kind of fly under the radar. I think it's 46% of delay repay 30 passengers claimed in 2020, which, of the kind of 100% who are eligible, less than half actually getting to the point of claiming is fairly stark. And that is, I believe, rising kind of compared to previous years. Of course, statistics in the past couple of years, believe it or not, have been a little bit squiffy. But I think that is quite interesting that a certain number of people have only kind of reached that point. And that another sort of interesting bit that I discovered that I'm sure our guests are all more than familiar with is the ORR sort of new delay repay code of practice that was just released, I think a week ago today, about effectively accessibility to delay repay and laying out exactly what specific information needs to be made available to customers and the areas in which that needs to be made available. And I think many TOCs actually adhere to many of these requirements already. Hopefully that will go a little bit further towards alleviating some of these kind of customer concerns and some of this confusion that we've seen that in theory should be resolvable.
That's really interesting and wonderful to see that that's come in. And I guess the kind of, I guess, the watchword that we're talking about here, which I think is really interesting, given the things that we can affect and the things that we can't. We know that there's always going to be delayed trains. Is communication and is helping passengers to understand what they can do within specific situations. And that kind of and I'd be really interested to hear from the group how they feel about that new kind of code of practice coming in. How whether the kind of the framework that we're putting up around delay repay, whether is that right? Is there anything new that needs to happen there, in your opinion? But I think what the report made clear was there are definitely areas of confusion for customers when they come to the point of trying to reclaim costs because of a delayed service. And I think within the report, you'll see more examples of that kind of customers going through that kind of process in practice. I think that's a really interesting kind of area to improve in. Wonderful. Well, those are the kind of the key areas that we wanted to give you a little sneak preview of. As I say, the report proper is coming out tomorrow. The people on this webinar will get it before anybody else. We'll ensure that you get, so check your inbox, you will get that before anyone else. Does anybody have any other questions, comments, or anything? Is there anything else come in, Joe, that we should highlight before we? I will say that obviously it's not the most kind of cheerful subject to talk about. I want you to know that Kelton has gathered together some real positives to end on. So do hang around for them. But if we don't have any other comments or queries, just to say this is my moment of humble begging. We're so keen to make these webinars better, to give them more insight and more useful information for you. So all I want for Christmas is for you to fill in this survey. It's very, very quick. There's not a lot to it. We just want to get a sense of, firstly, does this format work for you guys? Is there anything we can do to make it more valuable to you? Is there anything that we can, is there anything that you think we should try? And are there any subject areas that you think we should be looking at whilst we kind of go through them? We've obviously done accessibility and performance. The third one is going to be on passenger experience. So looking at all those kind of other areas of onboard, of going right from the booking process all the way through onboard and beyond, looking at how we can improve overall passenger sentiment. So we're really excited about that. We're fascinated to know what else you think we should be looking at in this area. and check your inboxes for the report tomorrow. So Kelton, you've obviously been talking about some quite heavy subjects today. I understand there's a bit of positivity that you want us to leave on.
I mean, yeah, as Steve said, there's a lot of sort of doom and gloom in this specific topic relating to Rail, but I mean, just, some positives to end on. Net satisfaction with complaint outcomes has risen again in this last year to almost 33%, which has followed an upward trend since 2017, I think, which is fantastic and something that I think you should all be very pleased with. Rail usage as well is trending slowly upwards, as passenger confidence grows, people are getting back on trains, which is, as I said about those statistics, looking a little bit squiffy. That line graph that, drops off very sharply, say, a few periods into 2020 is starting to look a little bit better now. And my last piece of good news is really only, I think, it's really only great news for the cat lovers in the crowd. But I think you will be pleased to know that George the Stourbridge Junction cat is as popular as ever after winning the RDG World Cup of Stations just last month. And in his wise words that were painstakingly translated to English, of course, by a number of dedicated station staff members, I recommend checking out his Twitter. It's full of daily affirmations and some really wonderful things, but be nice even when it doesn't matter. It could make such a difference to a stranger. Was something that I didn't expect to see coming from a cat, but it seems like a general good policy to end on. So, again, thank you all so much for coming along and sticking with us. And yeah, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, lovely rest of your festive season. We hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been such a pleasure speaking to you all. Please do keep your thoughts coming in on this and any other areas. Please do fill out the feedback form. We'd love to know what we can do better in this area. Even if most of the really great insight we gave to you today has come from other people in the audience and cats. But I think I'm really delighted that we can end our last webinar of the year on a positive note. There's so much good stuff happening out there, and hopefully when you check out the report tomorrow, you'll see a lot more of that kind of good stuff going on. But thank you so much for joining us, and if we don't speak to you, have a wonderful Christmas and a great new year, and we'll see you again then, I'm sure.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Thank you.